Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for the invite. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I would much rather be there in person, speaking to you face to face than doing this very unnatural thing, which is speaking to myself into a camera, which I hope I'll do okay, but if you just bear with me over the next 5 or 6 minutes, that would be much appreciated. My name is Tommy Kane. I have been asked to participate today because of the research that I did during my PhD, which looked into the regulation, the governance and the operations of water and wastewater services in Scotland. Much of my work since has been in other areas of public policy and politics, but I have obviously retained an interest in the subject of water, both here domestically and around the world, where the continuing global water crisis sees far too many people die before their time. This global crisis, which I'll just touch on very briefly, is a crisis that's perpetuated, frankly, because of, amongst other things, the mismanagement of water, its unequal distribution, and a lack of investment and political commitment to provide millions, if not billions, of people across the world with this most basic of needs. This global context is really important to consider when thinking about the provision of this most fundamental of services, which it is, and its governance. So let me just start in earnest by stating the obvious. Water is vital to life itself, vital. But there is still a tendency for people to assume water will always flow and that it has always done so. Well, clearly that's not the case across the world in 2025, but we know that in this country, across the UK, not that long ago, people were doing without water and wastewater services, and cholera outbreaks and dysentery outbreaks, etc., were commonplace. That was not that long ago. In modern times, indeed, our citizens in developed countries have a tendency to think only about water when they go to turn on the tap or fill the kettle or wash the dishes, flush the toilet, water the plants, take a shower, etc. But the operational processes that lie behind that and the governance of those processes that takes water from lakes or lochs to tap is too often taken for granted and not thought about or considered anywhere near enough. Neither, of course, is what we then do with wastewater and sewage. So how we provide and govern water services matters, because water is precious to life itself and to the vital functioning of life, society, and the wider economy. The goods we produce, the food we eat, the energy we consume, we all rely on water for these things, as does life itself, and of course, not just of human beings, but wider ecosystems. So it seems an obvious thing to say, but set against that understanding, water must be protected. And to do that, we need good and fair governance, and I would say a publicly owned and publicly accountable system that delivers on the basis of wider social and environmental needs. Not the needs of shareholders, who quite literally oversee billions of pounds of profits flowing out of water and wastewater services at the same time as sewage is flowing into rivers and the sea as a result of insufficient investment. That is why who owns water matters. How we steward water matters. How we regulate matters. How we treat drinking water matters. Discharging wastewater matters, and protecting our water resources matters. Cleaning water and preventing pollution matters. Conserving and replenishing water matters. Therefore, the values and the ethos that shape the ownership and governance of water and wastewater services are critical, not least in relation to how the way water is managed and regulated affects people, communities, and the wider environment. Now, during my research, I found some interesting information about the debate round about how water should be governed and owned and regulated. For many years, to this day, the dominant discourse propagated by powerful networks of lobbyists, think tanks, supranational institutions such as the UN and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund has been to govern water using market mechanisms. In water itself, very powerful market lobbyists have emerged, including the World Water Council and the Global Water Partnership, both of whom have been given an almost de facto status of supranational institution and who have propagated, obviously, the importance of taking a market approach to water services. An idea pushed, accepted within the dominant economic paradigm has been obviously to place a price on water, treating water and wastewater services as a standard commodity like any other. It is said that this approach can protect and manage water more effectively. That's a moot point. However, this approach, this ethos, this ideology is the embodiment of market environmentalism. Most notable in influencing and legitimising this thinking was the famous, some might say infamous, 1992 UN Conference on Water and the Environment held in Dublin in 1992, which agreed a set of principles about how we should govern water. Initially, this conference recognised scarcity and misuse of fresh water poses a serious and growing threat to sustainable development and the protection of the environment, yes. Human health and welfare, food security, industrial development and the ecosystems on which they depend are all at risk unless water and land resources are managed more effectively in the present decade and beyond than they have been in the past. Principle number 4, within that context, principle number 4 from that Dublin conference stated, water has an economic value in all its competing uses and should be recognised as an economic good. But, whilst of course there is some merit in that, water is not a commodity like any other. Treating water as a normal commodity is problematic for people without the financial wherewithal to purchase this water. If they are unable to purchase water, then they can, and we know that they often do, die. However, it should also be said that in describing water and wastewater services and describing and treating water and wastewater services as an economic good has created massive opportunities for those who see its value, its economic value, and an opportunity for profiting from providing water. So when researching my PhD, I did a tour of different water conferences. There's lots of water conferences across the world where people do speak about those opportunities. And I heard for myself some of the attitudes towards water as an economic good, not public good, and the opportunities envisioned from a desire to use water to help their own economic interests as opposed to thinking about the conservation and protection of water. Here are some of the statements I heard or unearthed during my research. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development said in 2006, in a world of ever-increasing water scarcity, the business sector is confronted with a host of strategic challenges as well as significant opportunities. One said at the World Water Week, which I went to in Stockholm in 2007, I didn't realise before this week that there was so much money in water. Global Water Intelligence, which is the journal of the privatised water industry, said in 2009, "This is the time for water and money. In these days of uncertainty, the big blue offers a dependability which has disappeared from the rest of the economy. As climate change and population growth leads to an ever more desperate search for water resources, the appeal of water becomes inexorable." Going further on to England, the failures of the privatisation in England are many. You know this better than me. From its inception, it has been problematic and has in many ways been abused for private gain from the very outset. The real life consequences of this are now being felt and understood, now more than ever, and have obviously inspired the work of this commission. Often when, and I hear this quite often by people down south, when denouncing privatised systems in England, critics often cite the contrast with the publicly owned water and wastewater services in Scotland. Professor David Hall, a friend of mine, just recently published research showing very important differences between the public Scottish system and the privatised English system, and how bills are lower in Scotland, and in terms of investment per capita, that's higher. There also appears to be a level of democratic accountability in Scotland. However, it is also important not to place Scottish water on a pedestal. Whilst there are clear advantages to retaining Scottish water in the public sector, the Scottish water version of, and the governance and regulation of, a public service should not be seen as a panacea. In my view, it is not. There are lessons to be drawn from the type of public corporation Scottish Water is, which merits a consideration of the nature of, as I would describe it, publicness, and what type of public model is most effective in engaging with and delivering for the public whose interests it is serving. This is, I think, especially important given arguably the erosion of that distinction between public and private institutions. The way Scottish Water is regulated, governed and delivers operations could be seen as an example of this erosion. The question of publicness is particularly relevant when considering the governance, regulation and operational delivery in Scotland, including the decoupling of operations from democratic accountability, the increasing role and power of unelected regulators to set budgets and charges, the application of private sector practices, as well as the increase of private sector contractors in the delivery of water and wastewater services. So, you will be unsurprised to hear me conclude that ownership matters, and that, as a fundamental public good and service critical to life itself, water and its associated services must always be retained in public control. But how that public service is governed and how it operates is really important and worthy of much consideration. The public must be part of that public service, and it must be properly democratically accountable. If designing a proper public service like the Scottish Water, if designing a proper public service, the Scottish Water model would not be the template I would recommend you to mimic. Expertise and technocratic knowledge is obviously important, but a people-led public utility, or at least one that's democratised, representative, accountable and answerable to the public it provides services to, is needed. Investment decisions must always be based on local need and pressing concerns, and the pressing concerns of local people, and with public involvement. They should not be solely in the gift of technocrats and faceless economic regulators. The users of water are citizens, not consumers, and water itself is a public good and service, not a commodity. In Scotland, as well as in England, a mindset shift is needed on these most important of principles. I hope that your commission will help in that effort. Finally, let me suggest that when we give it conscious thought, many of us consider our relationship with water as sacred, part of the commons, the shared inheritance of humankind, as the lifeblood of all human and non-human life. Yet our relationship to water is too often taken for granted, as are the processes and structures associated with the governance and the management of water. This Commission is challenging that, and I fully support your efforts in doing so. Thanks again for allowing me to contribute to and participate in this important commission. Well done for setting it up. Solidarity.